I must, of course, end this lecture with the field where the advent of Romanticism was the most palpable: poetry. As we have seen, traces of a deep and genuine feeling for nature can be found as early as Thomson's Seasons, a series of minor poets from the 1740s, not isolated outsiders, all well connected and sometimes even approved of Alexander Pope, evidence the same feature. It is sometimes prolonged by ideas describing nature as the essential locus of imagination, a privileged place of contact, as opposed to town and civilization, contact with primeval spiritual forces. This is the case with Mark Akenside, Pleasures of Imagination, Joseph Warton, his brother Thomas. The most well known is Edward Young, who achieved European fame with his Night Thoughts, where the blank verse adopts really a lyrical pathos unseen for decades. Just a quick example here. From short, as usual, and disturbed repose, I wake. How happy they who wake no more! Yet that were vain, if dreams infest the grave. I wake, emerging from a sea of dreams, tumultuous, where my wrecked, desponding thought, from wave to wave of fancied misery, at random drove a helm of reason lost. Of course, I was almost creating a parody and reading it, but you see, this sounds almost like Romanticism. First person confessional tone, but it's not a real confession. It's more like a rant, a declamation. This idea, very interesting idea, that the human mind is lost. The helm of reason lost. The helm on a ship is la barre, le gouvernail, you see. So the poor man, he's sleepless. He suffers from insomnia, basically, and he's already complaining about a sort of Weltschmerz, a sort of permanent state of dissatisfaction with the world. Here or there, we still have gods and goddesses and classical allusions, but the diction is already different. The second field, deserted by classical verse, though Greeks and Romans thought it the highest, was the sublime. Again, if you need a definition of what the sublime is, take a look at the footnotes. Even when dealing with religion proper, you have poets in that age of transition who plundered Greek and Roman antiquity or even the Bible for quotations. Typical example is Charles Jennens, who wrote the libretto for Handel's Messiah. But even then, English poetry began to look for new sources of the sublime. No longer Greek and Roman antiquity, no longer the Bible, its own past. Typical of this effort is Thomas Gray. Having published less than 20 poems in his lifetime, he nonetheless managed to bequeath whole phrases to the language, for instance, Far from the Madding Crowd, Kindred Spirit, or The Paths of Glory. This is thanks to pieces like his ever so famous Elegy written in a country churchyard, published in 1751. Though it's somewhat stiff, the quatrains unite feeling for nature precisely with the sublime, a grandiose reflection on life and death and England's destiny. Maybe we could take a look. It used to be very famous, and every schoolboy and schoolgirl used to know that poem. I think the first quatrain is enough to give you an idea. I'll magnify it so that you can read. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly over the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. You see, you already have the essential ingredients of Romanticism. It's still a bit stiff in terms of the verse pattern because it's so regular. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. Right, you see. So it's about the poet in a churchyard, typically, Gothic, romantic already. He is basically looking at the evening setting in and the lowing herd, le troupeau meuglant, that's the cows basically. They wind slowly over the lea. Doucement, les vaches reviennent en passant sur la prairie, and the ploughman, le laboureur, homeward plods his weary way. So civilization, the normal people, disappear and leaves the world to darkness and to me. You see, the poet is already, by definition, as he is about to speak, by definition, he is taken out of society. He is separated from the normal world, and he turns to the world of darkness, the oncoming night, where he will find meaning, the sublime, you see. And the source of this sublime, it's no longer the gods, it's no longer the Bible, it's those very standard English country scenes. The lowing herd, the ploughman, the country churchyard, and he will go on and his reflection will turn to the history of England and the past of England. So again, something completely new. Thomas Gray was also among the first to be interested in the distant Nordic past. I have given you here, for instance, a poem about the fatal sisters. You see, les Nornes, the Norns, the Nordic goddesses of fate. If you read the poem, you'll soon realize this could never have been written by Alexander Pope. This reach towards the past, medieval, Celtic, and Nordic, was greatly helped by scholars. The most well-known is Bishop Thomas Percy, who published a collection in 1775 called Relics of Ancient English Poetry. This contained some nearly 200 medieval ballads from manuscripts. The Ballad of Chevy Chase, The Dragon of Wantley, Sir Patrick Spens, etc. It provided material for countless later poems, and somehow pioneered what the Grimm brothers did for German folklore and culture in the 19th century, a grounding for what you might call romantic nationalism, coupled with the general concept of the past being superior to the present. You see, taking a close look at the national past. This past being, by definition, supposed to be superior to the present. And all of this going all the way to one of Rousseau's key notions, challenging Hobbes, the notion of a primary, asocial, innocent, and therefore superior state of nature. This is what Rousseau formulated in 1755 in his Discourse on the Origin and Basis of Inequality Among Men. Now here it's only for the realm of poetry, but of course, as you know, this can lead to much more explosive ideas indeed. Of course, Rousseau was one of the leading thinkers whose ideas were somehow recycled, perhaps deformed, by the French Revolution. This enthusiasm was the enthusiasm triggered by Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, can be seen in many works that went even further than getting inspiration from the past. They went into complete reinvention of the past, working only on partly genuine sources, pretending not to have invented the rest, but actually having invented the rest. The classic case is the Scottish poet James Macpherson, who first published fragments of ancient poetry collected in the Highlands of Scotland, translated from the Gaelic or Erse language, that's the ancient Scottish Gaelic language, before ending up actually publishing his own epic. He pretended this was from a genuine poet, past poet by the name of Ossian, and eventually he published the Works of Ossian. Well, bogus or not, the success was Europe-wide. Napoleon said that Ossian was his favorite reading. And famous names like, characters in the Works of Ossian, like Oscar and Malvina, made an unexpected comeback. People started giving names like Oscar and Malvina to their children. Another classic case is the young poor poet Thomas Chatterton, who even adopted a medieval persona. He tried to claim that he was resurrecting the works or delivering the works of Thomas Rowley, but in fact Thomas Rowley was Thomas Chatterton, writing in pseudo-Middle English. Sadly, he committed suicide at 17 in a garret. Well, at least he was creating the first and iconic typical exit of Romanticism in all but name. Other pre-Romantic trends connected with those already mentioned included involvement in politics, or at least humanitarian causes. Oliver Goldsmith, we've already mentioned him, published The Deserted Village in 1770 to lament the consequences of rural flight, l'exode rural. Of course, in those days, the Industrial Revolution was already starting to have consequences. Another important poet is William Cowper, special pronunciation for the name, Cowper. He published a long rambling poem called The Task in 1785, which denounced, among others, slavery and blood sports. He pioneered introspection, the writing of autobiographical poems. Nonetheless, sometimes it was different. He published, for instance, John Gilpin, a comic ballad about a draper on a runaway horse. So he still demonstrated that this was not yet full-blown romanticism. You could still have an element of comedy in the productions. Another case is, of course, Scotland's national poet, Robert Burns, Robbie Burns. Yeah, always a lively poet too. He wrote patriotic, historical poems, again looking for inspiration in the national past. He wrote political ones. He was a committed abolitionist and egalitarian. And of course, he wrote poems profoundly connected with nature and rural Scotland. The Bard of Ayrshire, as he was known, published his first volumes of poems in 1787, poems chiefly in the Scottish dialect. This made him famous and a society figure in Scotland, but he long in fact remained a farmer. His masterpiece is the narrative poem Tam o' Shanter, which celebrates drink and drunkards, but not without delicacy. So you see again the blend between things that already look like romanticism and still the persistence of, comedy, celebration of drink, things that are not really romantic. At the same time, there is beauty in it, delicacy. I have given you here a short excerpt. The beginning, typically not romantic. Care mat to see a man so happy, Ian drowned himself among the nappy. As bees flee hum with lades of treasure, the minutes swing their way with pleasure. Kings may be blessed, but Tam was glorious. Oh, other hills, a life victorious. Okay, his hero, Tam, he's happy because he's completely drunk. Yeah, okay. But then suddenly, you have a little quatrain, which is ever so delicate. But pleasures are like poppies spread, comme les pavots. You seize the flower, its bloom is shed, or like the snowfalls in the river, a moment white, then melts forever. You see the profound change in feeling, even with the Scots, even with Robbie Burns. Last but not least comes William Blake. He was a poet, but also a painter, a printer, and an illustrator of his own books. Blake was a mystic visionary whose every composition, verbal or visual, played a part as a piece in the vast puzzle of his world view. He led a very isolated life. He was a solitary man. You might even say he was in a state of rebellion permanently. This was connected to his perception of man. He always refers to Adam to describe the condition of man. Man being in a permanent struggle with spiritual forces of light and darkness. He is undoubtedly one of the greatest poets in the language. Only three essential works must be quoted here. The Songs of Innocence, 1789, which were republished in 1794 together with the Songs of Experience and The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The first two collections are obviously twinned. They translate the two contrary states of the human soul according to Blake. Eden before the fall, that's the Songs of Innocence, and after the fall, that's the Songs of Experience, struggle for redemption. Angelic childhood purity versus adult suffering under a sort of curse. The lamb versus the tiger. These are perhaps his most famous two most famous poems. The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, in fact, offers a sort of solution to this endless opposition, at least the hope of a final resolution of the contraries. Human laws are abolished, there is a new regenerated mankind emerging. Typically enough, Blake's most famous piece, apart from the tiger and the lamb, is the 1804 poem Jerusalem, which is still sung today on countless football terraces and cricket stands in a musical setting, but probably the sports fans do not really understand the territories the poet explores. I'm sure you've heard that song. I mean, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? Oh, I'm sure you've heard it. In fact, in order to understand Blake, maybe you don't need to understand the mysticism, because the verse is beautiful in itself. You see, here he's referring to Christ having visited England. It's a sort of mystical vision. But you don't even need that to appreciate the beauty of the verse. If you take a look at the tiger, I have provided it together with, of course, the lamb. You see, the lamb is from the Song of Innocence. It symbolizes childhood purity, and the tiger, on the contrary, is a creature of this state, this fallen state of man after the fall, where nature around him is absolutely frightening. Even if you don't understand the mysticism behind the poem, I think you will appreciate the beauty and the rhythm. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Well, nearly everybody knows those lines. They are ever so famous, and indeed beautiful. It could be a real tiger, but it's probably the tiger in his head, you see. You have the illustrations here. And of course, this is miles and miles away from the age of Alexander Pope. This is ever so modern. This is really Romanticism, all but in name. It was about to emerge. To conclude on Blake, well, I must say, of course, that he heralds the dark, mystical side of Romanticism. You might even say the satanic side, the rebellious side of Romanticism. And of course, he's a poet for fellow mystics, and W.B. Yeats, the famous Irish poet, 20th century Irish poet, was definitely fond of Blake, and he edited his works. He is, perhaps he is the best conclusionist to quote Wordsworth, who is reported to have said that there was no doubt that this poor man was mad, but there is something in the madness of this man which interests me more than the sanity of Lord Byron and Walter Scott. Well, he worked till the very day he died, illustrating Dante's Divine Comedy. Well, even that is symbolic. Film and TV references, as usual, totally subjective. As usual, we have Tristram Shandy adaptations, but they're complete disasters. As to George III, he's always treated from the madness angle, and, well, a good documentary is George III, The Genius of the Mad King, 2017. In terms of TV adaptations, I would suggest a TV series focusing on law cases and the legal practice. Might sound miles away from literature, but in fact, if you watch that series, Garrow's Law, you get an insight into the late 18th century intellectual debates and the change from sentiment to moral sentiment to relativism and to those rebellious ideas that would lead to Romanticism. Few films, maybe. Bell. It's about slavery, and again, through the debate of slavery, you can feel, you can understand the changing moral climate of the age. Same goes for The Duchess. Oh well, classic Georgian representation, Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, of course. And a very, very old, musty black and white film, The Young Mr Pitt, directed by Carol Reed, 1942. Still interesting on politics. The must-reads. Oh, I'm sure you've understood from what I was telling you. Laurence Sterne, Sentimental Journey. The School for Scandal, of course. The Monk. This is the one you'll enjoy, I think. And William Blake, Selected Poems, of course.